One thing that you and I have in common with each other and with everybody else on this planet, and that's fingerprint. Fingerprints have been around for a long time, been around as long as people have had fingers, which is a long time. And they've actually found fingerprints on some of the clay tablets that came out of Babylon. They've found them in some of the Egyptian tombs. And so people have known about these. But what's interesting, if you look back in history, is that actually around 200 BC, they started using fingerprints on documents in China to kind of authenticate them. It was probably in the mid 1800s that they came to the realization that everybody had a unique fingerprint. And then they developed some of the technology to actually ink the fingerprints and be able to compare them and find out, in forensics, find out, who was at a crime scene, who wasn't. And of course, even today, when they get there and they begin to look for DNA and begin to look for fingerprints, they have to know the difference between the fingerprints of the person who's the victim or the person who got stolen from and the fingerprints of the person who actually did it. Now, as I thought about this, I realized, that if you dusted the planet, if you dusted history for fingerprints, you'd find God's fingerprints all over them because He's at work everywhere and He always has been, even in the difficult times. And I think this is the way God works. He never wears gloves. And though sometimes what He does is a little bit hidden, He's always there. He always leaves His fingerprint someplace. Now, when we look back in history, we find out that, of course, Jesus died, and this is not a secret. There are crosses everywhere. Everybody knows about this. The surprising thing is that Jesus didn't just have people who loved him, he was the personification of love. But he also had people who hated him and wanted him dead. And of course, the question is why? Why would anybody want Jesus dead? Well, whenever you threaten somebody's power or threaten their money or threaten their kingdom or their power or their prestige, they'll do almost anything to hold on to it. And it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure that out. What God was doing through Jesus actually started at creation. Back when we first screwed up and what we did affected the planet, God made it clear that He was going to intervene and He was going to do something. And you can find the trail of clues all through the Bible, basically God telling us what He's going to do. And it's one of these things where He works in unexpected places. If you've ever watched Mission Impossible, they're masks and then they do voiceovers and so on. So they have all this stuff. God's plot in this would actually make them scratch their heads because it goes all over the place. God is absolutely wise in everything that He does. Now, one of the things that I want to couch what I'm saying today is has to do with seasons. Okay, so we're going to kind of work with that. And if you kind of can look at the seasons of life, April 2nd, 30 AD was summer, and it was Palm Sunday. Fall was Palm Sunday night. Winter was Passover, and spring was Easter, April 7th, 30 AD. Now, philosophers and poets down through the years have talked about the seasons of life, the seasons of the soul, things we go through. In other words, life never stays the same. Summer is the time when everything's going well, sky's blue, sun's shining, mama's pretty, daddy's rich. That's the time, it's what we always like. Fall is a season of change. It's when things begin to chill out. We begin to feel the winds of change. Winter is the season that we dread the most, I think, and it's where everything is cold. It seems like nothing's alive. And then spring comes, and it goes that cycle keeps on going, always has. Now, I'm guessing that some of you right now, if you were to identify a season that you're in, you could probably do that. And most of us, I think, would find ourselves in the season of fall. This whole COVID-19 thing has changed everything. And it seems to me like we went from summer to fall in just a matter of a few days back in early March. And so we're still trying to make sense of it. Sometimes when we're in the middle of a season, especially fall or winter, we think to ourselves, is it ever going to be summer again? Is everything going to ever get back to normal? Now, here's what I know. This season will pass. The second thing is that God is at work in the middle of it. And there will come a time when what we're going through is going to pass. And it's God who controls all the seasons of life, no matter what we do. Now, if we were to start back on Palm Sunday, back on 30 AD, it was honestly the climax of everything that Jesus had done in his ministry. He'd been going for 3 years and people had been healed. Lots of things had been happening. There was no sickness he couldn't cure. And this wasn't just like people, whose, one leg was shorter than the other thing. This was people who were missing part of their faces because of leprosy. It was people who, couldn't walk, people who had limbs missing, even the dead. Jesus raised the dead. So this was a phenomenal time. This was summertime and everybody was excited about it. Maybe the most astounding thing about Jesus was his absolute power over darkness. There was one occasion where this guy was crazy with demons and came, and he knew who Jesus was. He knew that he wasn't just some ordinary Joe. He's screaming, and Jesus, with a single word, was able to send the demons out of him. He had that kind of power. That was summer. That was the time, you see, when it was really cool to be friends with Jesus. And his closest team members, were probably out there saying, see that guy over there, the one that's healing everybody out in the mountainside? Like, I'm his good friend. If you need, if you want to get close to him, you can come to me. It was a summer day. I want you to think about summer in your life. Like, what is the perfect summer day for you? Some of you, it's laying on a beach someplace doing your best to get skin cancer. Okay, that's unfair shot, not fair. For me, a perfect summer day usually has something to do with water and water sports and swimming and family and fishing, and then a great cookout, with all the fish that I've caught that day. One of the greatest summer days for Jesus and his followers was the day when he interrupted a funeral. A close friend of Jesus, Lazarus, had died. And Jesus took 4 days to get there. So he gets there, and Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, very upset with him because they said, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. And then, in an act of extraordinary power, Jesus raises this guy, Lazarus, from the dead. Like he walks out of a grave. He'd been in there for 4 days. And that happened right before what we know now as Palm Sunday. Let me read the account of Palm Sunday. As he rode along, the crowds spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles that they had seen. Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Bless, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. But some of the Pharisees among the crowd said, Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that. And he replied, if they kept quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers. Now, what this parade said to the people was that this was summertime. And what they were thinking about this was that this was the time when the Roman occupation was going to be over. They're now going to be the head instead of the tail, And Messiah had arrived and he was leading the people back to the city. And this was going to result in a time of incredible peace, a time when Israel would rule the world. Now, people had been waiting 3 years for this moment. And I'm guessing the disciples are saying, man, this is so good. I hope this never ends. Because that's how we feel about summer. But there were other people who hated it. As we can see here, it was the Pharisees. It was basically the religious leaders. And I'll tell you why. They had everything to lose. If Jesus was the new king, they were the ones that had basically said, this guy's a fake. And then he raises somebody from the dead. It says in the passage in John, it says, many in the crowd had seen Jesus call Lazarus from the tomb, raising him from the dead, and they were telling others about it. That was the reason so many went out to meet him, because they had heard about this miraculous sign. And then the Pharisees said to one another, there's nothing we can do. Look, everyone has gone over to him. So what do you do when you've been telling people, and you're the big shot, you're the religious leader who's supposed to interpret the times, and you're telling everybody this guy's a fake, and then he raises somebody from the dead? What do you do with that? So you can understand why this created so much problem among the religious professionals. And it was that kind of blindness that made Jesus cry. This is the passage. Let me read this. Luke chapter 19. But as he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city ahead, he began to weep. How I wish today that all of people would understand the way to peace. But now it's too late. And peace is hidden from your eye because you did not recognize it when God visited you. Summer season of the soul is a time when life is good and you feel safe and there seems to be plenty to go around, and there are no crises looming on the horizon. These are the days that we look back on and say, that was the good old days when that happened. Now, here's what I know because I've done this, okay? It's possible to be right in the middle of summer, right in the middle of a blessed life, and miss summer. Summer actually is the only season that you can miss. I mean, you can't miss fall. It blows through and the leaves change, and it's obvious that it's fall. Can't miss winter. Everything's frozen and dead and it's dark. You can't miss winter. And you can't miss spring because all the snow melts and the streams start to run again and the trees start to bloom. You can't miss that, but you can miss summer. The question is why? Why do we miss the summer seasons in our lives? Sometimes it's busyness. Sometimes it's because, we kind of have a whining spirit, and, there's mosquitoes out there, and it's too hot and we have all kinds of things to complain about. Sometimes it's a forensic thing, though. Sometimes we mistake our fingerprints for God's. We think we're the ones that brought summer on. So, just some simple advice when it comes to the summer season of life. Don't miss it because you can. Remember that God is the one who gives us summer. God is the originator of every good and perfect gift. Don't begin to pat yourself on the back and think that you're the one that brought summer because you didn't. Secondly, and this is really important, make sure that you include some celebration in your life. That's what we see here with Palm Sunday. The ancients said that if you don't take time to actually celebrate and feel the joy, then they say that sin can actually start to look good. And that's not a good thing, right? Jesus said here, there were some crabby people trying to shut up the kids and tell Jesus to control his crowd. And Jesus says, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. In other words, rocks have more sense to see God in their lives than sometimes people do. And there's one final thing that I want to say about summer. Don't forget God. Because you see, sometimes when things are going really well, it's kind of like, yeah, 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 well, someday, in the future and so on, if I need him and so on, we actually forget about God. And I'll tell you, don't do that. It's in the summer season when you and I need to get down on our knees and say, God, I am so grateful for everything that I enjoy. I realize that it all came from you. Sometimes we don't do that. We all know that summer's over when the cool winds start to blow. Sometimes the cold winds start to blow. And if you're you know, out in Alberta, you might actually get snow at this time. And you kind of enter into, when the winds of change start to blow, enter into something that you could call the tunnel of chaos. It's like what we're in right now, where everything seems to be changing. What no one knew back then was that Palm Sunday was the last day of summer, because I'm telling you, it was right that night on Palm Sunday night when things started to change. Jesus was in the temple, which of course was the hot spot. It was Herod's pride and joy. They said that, in the summer when the sun was shining on it, you could barely look on it because it was this gleaming white. So Jesus goes into this, masterpiece, kind of the center of religion, and he starts cleaning the place out. You know why he had to do that? Is because there was this whole money-making business that was going on there, where they were selling, they were changing coins and they were selling sacrifices and so on. And it actually made the priests rich. And it actually benefited Rome because they got their piece of it too. So, what do you think is going to happen when you go into the center of power and prestige in a city and you muck with it? It's going to be problems. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, this shouldn't have been a surprise to Jesus' disciples because he told them plainly several times what was going to happen. It says that right after Peter said that he knew that Jesus was the Messiah and so on, it says this: from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And fall came. If I'm reading the disciples right, the fear begins to creep in that night. Judas, when Mary came in and anointed Jesus, which was Palm Sunday night, and Judas got up immediately and went out and started the proceedings to betray Jesus. I'm guessing that there was fear in their hearts. And when they began to see the opposition the next day start, I'm guessing that they were afraid, because that's the natural result when fall starts to come to our lives. I'm guessing that when Jesus was out there, telling the Pharisees, the whole thing about, you guys are, whoa, you're like, you're stacking people's backs with burdens that they can't carry, that they may have said to Jesus privately, you called them snakes today. That's not very good. Like, if you back off, maybe they could be really good friends and they could help us do what we're supposed to do. But I'm telling you, Jesus didn't, and they were just cranky. I mean, they were out for blood. And the stir that Jesus was creating had the Romans nervous too, because they knew that Jerusalem was a hot spot for controversy and for mobs rising up and creating problems. So they're nervous too. And Jesus had clearly told his disciples, fall is here, and I'm going to die. And that was the reality check. You see, they were thinking when they first rode into Jerusalem, Jesus was on a donkey and all the crowds are there. They're thinking, this is the beginning of the of the really good time. But it ended up that they weren't going to be sitting on cushy thrones, telling the Romans what to do. Jesus had said to them, just earlier before this, he had said, you're not here to be served. You're here to serve and to give your life away. This is a whole new deal. So about 4 to 5 weeks ago, we passed from the summer season, kind of life is normal, the stock market's doing well, we're doing well, into a whole season of change. And it happened very quickly, didn't it? We've been told that the US, especially in the US, there's 51,000 cases or more right now in New York City. We are in a time of upheaval, and it has affected the entire world. There's no doubt about it. We're right in the middle of fall. Stock market, is in trouble. And then there's work, and schools have postponed, and travel is off, and the sales of just about everything. And you can't go to a restaurant. You can't go to a sports event. There are whole sections of the government. And I'll tell you, this is a time of change. It's a tunnel of chaos. And we don't know when it's going to end or what it's going to feel like coming out of it. Things have changed, and there will be some things, I'm guessing, that will never be the same again. Jesus encourages his disciples when they hit this time of change. You know what it means to be encouraged? I have a little drawing here, okay, that's going to show you. To encourage means to pour courage into somebody's heart. And that's what he did for his disciples. And I think that's what he wants to do for us. He wants to pour courage into our hearts. He told them that night, when they sat down for their last meal together, he said, the most powerful force in the universe, the one who performed miracles through my life, is now going to be in you. And he's going to change the world through you. And he says, I will give you power and you'll do greater things than I did. Jesus was handing his mission off to them, which had to be scary. And then he prayed. He prayed for them, and he prayed for us too. He prayed that we would be one. He prayed that we would be able to carry on his mission on this planet and make a difference and live lives that are worthy of our calling to do that. Fall season of life, though, is hard, isn't it? Fall, especially early fall, has always been my favorite season. I love summer, and enjoy being out there, being fishing. Fall, though, gives me energy. And I'll tell you why. It's because I like to run. And when I run in the fall, it's cool and the leaves are out there, gold and red and yellow and so on. And it's just a great time to exercise and to run. I used to think that I loved change too. Okay. I kind of saw myself as Ken, the fearless change agent. And I thought, why don't people like this? Change is great, change is necessary. I mean, how can a baby ever grow up without changing? They can't. Change has to happen. Then a number of years ago, I went through a time when just about everything in my life changed. Okay. From how I did my job and what church I was at, down to the structure of our family, our parents' lives, they started going through difficulty. Lori's parents started going through difficulty, where we worshiped, who our friends were, who our friends weren't. And suddenly, me, Mr. Lover of Change, began to long for a place in my life where I felt like I was on solid ground, And some of you are saying, serves you right, Ken. And I would agree, it does, okay? Change can create stress. It does create stress. And you get too much of it in your life, and it can create health problems. There was a study done years ago on change. It's called the Holmes Rey Test. And so they started at death, where, change ratio is like 100%, where you lose a spouse or you lose a child. And then there's divorce, which hits about a 73, and Christmas hits about a 12. So at one point, I added up all the changes that were going on in my life, and the score I got was 294. Apparently, you're supposed to be dead at 300. Okay, so at that point, even a speeding ticket could be lethal. I think a speeding ticket's around 25. Some of you are maxed out on change right about now, and you're feeling the anxiety down in your heart. Now, here's the problem: life is about change. It is. You can't live life without it. Joan London, if you remember, was the host of Good Morning America, and she was forced out of her role because they thought she was too old. And she said, the only one who enjoys change is a wet baby. And that's about right. So if we really don't like change, then how do we handle it? One of the key words about this is transition. And a guy by the name of William Bridges wrote a book by that title a number of years ago. And he says that you have to transition. Transition means letting go of where you are, letting go of the past, and then moving on in an orderly way into the future. Okay. And life is actually a whole series of beginnings and endings. Think of how many changes a baby has to go through before they even get to school, okay? You imagine, baby saying, I remember the good old days when mom used to make the milk and give it to me, and she used to carry me where I needed to go. That was way more efficient. I'm just toddling around now. I can't go very quickly. So why should I have to walk? Being dependent, you see, has to end for us to grow to be independent. And that's what has to happen through life. Now, here's our struggle. It's hard to imagine that something like COVID-19 could cause things to change for the better. I mean, how do you figure that? And here's what I know: God didn't cause this, but God is able to work in horrible situations, and good can actually come out of them when we let Him work through us. But we have a choice. And the most important thing when you're in the middle of transition, when you're letting go of something and grasping onto something else, is hope. Hope that you're not just going to fall. You see, because Jesus was God, he could have forced the religious leaders to stop what they were doing. He could have nuked them all, and he could have brought in his kingdom and so on. And Peter was thinking to himself, when they're out in Gethsemane, and the guards came to take control of him, he brings out his sword. He says, "We're going to stop this right now." And Jesus said to Peter, "I don't need your sword. If I needed to, I could call on my Father, and I could have 12,000 angels here immediately." But Jesus knew that God had a much greater plan, that what he was doing wouldn't just change this little group, change Jerusalem, it would change everything. That what he was going through would reveal how empty religion is and how hostile it can be, and reveal how full of ourselves that we really are. His plan was not preserving, you see, the good old days. His plan was to save the world. And the only way he could do that was by going through the cross. As someone has said, don't be afraid of the future because God is already there. See, our struggle is not necessarily the future. I think we sometimes wonder what it is. Our struggle is the in between time between what is and what used to be. One of the best illustrations of this I've ever heard as a whole illustration of the trapeze, of what transition is. Transition is basically when you're letting go of the past and you're kind of hanging out there in midair before you can grab onto the next one that's coming. And that's the fall season of life, you see. You might fall. You let go of one and grab onto another one, and that's when the danger is. That's it could be described. If you've ever watched the Peanuts cartoon, it's when Linus's blanket is in the dryer, and he's got to wait for it to finish. Our hope is not in what we see staying the same. Our hope is in God, who is always the same and yet is there in changes. Okay? Our hope is in the unstable times that God is the one who holds all things in his hands. And he promises us, I'll never leave you. Remember the promise that I read a few weeks ago? I will show up and take care of you as I promised. I know what I'm doing. I have it all planned out. Plans to take care of you, not abandon you. Plans to give you the future that you hope for. When you call on me and when you come and pray to me, I'll listen. The winter, which was going to show up the next day, in that time, Jesus made it really clear, I'm not going to leave you. where, he's off in some tomb and stuff, and he's decaying and he's never coming back. And the disciples are trying to think, okay, well, who's going to be healing people out on the hillside tomorrow? He said, I'm not going to leave you as orphan children. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But this was a necessary step because it was going to take his sacrifice to change the winter, because fall was going to lead to winter. See, redeeming the world is no easy task. And this leads to an important question when it comes to change. I have to ask myself, what am I learning during this time? Because see, part up to this time, I've depended on, meeting on Sundays and having a stable time when everybody gathers and so on. That's not happening these days, as you can tell by me doing this, okay? See, we have to be transformed in this process. And that's what Paul says needs to happen. He describes the kind of change that we need to go through. And he uses the word metamorpho. Can you imagine what that word means? It means metamorphosis. It's what happens, that turns, this grimy little caterpillar, from eating leaves into a butterfly that flies over top of the trees. He said that's what has to happen in you. But he said, it won't happen unless you give yourselves fully to God. He says, I beg you to give yourselves as a living sacrifice to God. That's a smart thing to do, because then he can transform you and he can help you to face the future. Now, caterpillars build cocoons by instinct, and they go through this dramatic change. One time I caught a caterpillar because I was into snakes and frogs and all this stuff, caught this caterpillar, put it in a jar, and sure enough, it made a cocoon in there. And I waited and waited and waited and waited, and it never turned into a butterfly. I thought maybe it'd be a butterfly and it would fly around in the jar. But I cut the thing open and it had died in the cocoon. The point of a cocoon is not to go into it and just stay there, until Jesus comes to rescue you. The point is to change. That's what Jesus does in our lives in times of change. He changes us. Listen to what Jesus said to guys who didn't know what to expect from that point on. He says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. It takes trust to make it through. He says, that tunnel of chaos thing that you have going on in your heart, or feels like you got a hurricane there? He says it's normal, but it doesn't have to continue. It doesn't have to make you anxious and fearful and deathly afraid of the future. Trust in God, trust also in me. He made another promise that night. He said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your heart be troubled, and don't be afraid. I don't know if you heard the announcement of the U.S. president in the last few days and so on, but he says there's tough times ahead. What he went on to say is that 100,000 people could die because of this thing. Now, I have a lot of family in the United States, and I have a number of them who are in the high risk category, and I can't do a thing about that. And so I have to trust something. I'm not going to trust the government. I have to trust God. And Jesus offers us the chance to let go of this backpack that we carry that's filled with rocks, all this anxiety, all this uncertainty about what the future is going to hold. And we can leave it with Him. My peace I give to you. Jesus makes one more statement that night, right in the tunnel of chaos, and it's for us too. He says, because I've said these things, you're filled with grief. We are, aren't we? It's tough. But I tell you the truth. Listen to this. This is so important. It's for your good that I'm going away. Unless I go away, the counselor will not come. But if I go, I will send him to you. And it's this simple. When God is orchestrating change, when God is working through change, it means that something better is coming. And I can imagine when Jesus said that, the disciples were thinking, what could possibly be better than sitting here at the table with you tonight? And maybe Jesus would answer, it's when every table in the world is sitting with me there at the very center of what goes on. Because unless I give my life, that will never happen. God is changing the world, not preserving the past. In closing, I just want to remind you, the fingerprints of God are all over everything. The fingerprints of God are over your past. They're over your life. They're over the people that you care about. When it comes to summer, don't take credit for that, because God's fingerprints are all over that. God is the one who blesses us. And remember, with hope, God's fingerprints are all over the future. He's there. He's there already. He's in charge of everything that happens. It's not some rogue virus that's in charge. It's not, health coverage. It's not banks. It's not jobs, family, anything else. God is there. God sees the future. He's already there, and He holds us. And He says, I will give you my peace if you'll trust me, if you'll trust me. So let's pray for that to happen. God, this Sunday, today, our world is in chaos. Chaos of change. Everything's changing. For the 7 billion people in this world, things are changing faster than anybody ever dreamed they could. But they're not out of control. You didn't cause this virus. There was something from a piece of meat in a market that caused this. But you are at work all through this, and you are able to somehow bring good out of something that seems so disastrous. I pray that, God, we would set aside the cockiness of it appearing that we can just kind of live our lives without you. I pray that you'll help us to realize that you hold everything in your hands and you're at work under every circumstance. Give us hope. Encourage us. Help us, God, to see reality that you are at work and your fingerprints are on everything in this universe. Amen. So may God go with you this week. May He give you strength. May He give you courage to face whatever you have to face. And may He give you hope that this is not the end, that He controls that. Amen.